Hello, everybody. Great to see you all here. And thank you for joining us at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. My name is Indu Saxena, and I have the privilege to initiate this discussion. And today's topic is US-China competition in the Central Asia. To begin the discussion, please allow me to provide some context here. As we all know that the 5 countries of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan were once part of the Soviet Union and so have the legacy and inheritance from present-day Russia. Now, the question is to what extent these countries continue to be impacted by Russian influence, especially given the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. That is one major power there. And along with Russia, China aims to expand its strategic influence through border or initiative projects and other corridor projects. The Chinese economy holds significant sway over these countries, offering various opportunities and connectivity. China will say dominant force in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes member countries such as Russia, India, and Pakistan. On the other side, the United States involvement with the group C5+1 and other initiatives to counterbalance the Chinese influence and to secure the US interest in the region. Not only the US-China strategic competition in this region, but there are some other players like India and Iran. So the question we will be talking and discussing about mainly of the US-China competition, but if we see that is Russia and China's assertive behavior is posing a threat to peace and stability of this region? If yes, or if so, what security guarantees does the United States provide? Maybe we can, and what are the regional implications here, looking at the India, Pakistan, and other SCO groups that is hopefully will be expanding in the coming years. To walk through all these complex questions, we have a stellar panel. Please allow me to introduce today's panelists. We have Ambassador Stobdan. Ambassador Stobdan is a former diplomat. He served in Central Asia as the Indian ambassador to Kyrgyzstan and first secretary at the Embassy of India in Almaty. He authored several books, policy briefs, strategic commentary, and monographs focused on Central Asia. He regularly lectures at various universities and defense colleges, and he is a member of several advisory council of Government of India and at Intergovernmental Forum. Welcome, sir. We have Professor Alexander Cooley. He is a Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an academic adjunct faculty member at Chatham House. He served as the director of Harriman Institute in Columbia University. In addition to his academic research, Professor Cooley serves on several international advisory boards engaged with the region and has testified for the United States Congress and Helsinki Commission. Professor Cooley's opinion pieces have appeared in New York Times, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Professor. We have Dr. Preeti D. She is an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University's Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies in India and has been awarded numerous research grants and projects in the field. She has also served on several university and publication boards within the area. And then we have Dr. Muhammad Ali Beg. He will be joining. He's a research scholar at National Defense University, Islamabad in Pakistan. Now, before handing it over to Shahir, who will take the charge of the question and answer session, I would like to announce that the views expressed and presented here are personal, should not be constituted to any affiliation and organization. And audience, please type your question in the chat section. We look forward to your questions. And thank you. Over to you, Shahir.
Thank you, Dr. Indu, for the opening remarks. As she have mentioned that we are delighted to have today our distinguished panelists, and we thank them for participating in the webinar on US-China competition in Central Asia and its regional implications. So we are looking forward to hear the remarks on several dimensions ranging from political, economic, and strategic realms. So thank you to all our distinguished panelists for joining us today. So regarding the format, as she has explained that each speaker will deliver their remarks, and at the conclusion of the event, we are expecting to have an engaging Q&A sessions. So without any further delay, I am passing the torch to His Excellency Ambassador Punchak Stobdan to deliver his remarks. Sir, please, the ground is to you.
Well, I thought you have few questions. On the basis, we will have the discussion. And it's true that the rivalry, great power rivalry has been escalating for the past couple of months, which is going to shape the region in a very different way. But let me tell you that the most significant aspect of this change in Central Asia is the, for the first time, say after 2000 years, and more precisely, say since the Tang dynasty in the 6th, 7th century, the Chinese are looking at landward dimension. They have been a maritime power, but now they are reorienting themselves as a land power, which falls into this Eurasian Central Asian region. And I must say, because I've served there for many, many years and been going there since the independence of these countries, that the Chinese entry here has been very, very smooth, very subtle, and very calculated. We have to really study the process, and I've seen the process, quite impressed by it. But let me also tell you that Central Asians are not great lovers of China. They are not fascinated with what China is because of some historical reasons, some cultural reasons, some other reasons. They don't particularly like the Chinese. There is a word. There are many proverbs in the region about China. Negative proverbs, of course. Overall, Chinese are called Karkitai, the black Chinese. Is a very, they look at China in a very with a disdain, with some kind of a negative mindset. But at the same time, I must say that in the last 30 years or so, while they may still not be liking the Chinese, but they can't live without China. It's something, it's because of the circumstances, because of the reordering of the change since the Soviet collapse. And they are just fallen into the Chinese trap, and they just can't get away. And it's a hard reality is that they can't do. Whereas I think they may be liking Pakistan or India or Turkey very much, but they can live without us. But they can't live without China. It's the reality. It's the economic reality, or you may call it whatever reality it may be. This is what I see on the ground. But more particularly in the last 8 to 9 years, in the last 15 years or so, since 2008, 2007, Chinese have been consistently trying to reorient the region. When I say reorienting the region, means they want to reorient Central Asia away from the Russian mold. What is being Soviet before is now been changed into something like, I won't say Sinocentric, but it's true that from the primary school onwards, they have been teaching Mandarin. And in the last 15, I'm sure those boys and girls, when I was there in 2007, today they must be 20 years old, 15 years old, they speak fluent Mandarin. And this allows the Central Asian to seek jobs in China, do business with China. So the thinking has changed. The new generation Central Asians no longer think the Soviet way or even the Russian way. In many places, Russians is no longer spoken in many cities. They speak either their own language or they prefer French, German, Chinese, Turkish, or things like that, even English. So this is a change which is phenomenal, and we may not like it. That's another matter, but that's a reality. But certainly, in the wake of Ukraine crisis, the geopolitical context has changed. For a while, we thought Central Asia was looking for a alternative options away from Russia because of the Ukraine thing. And they stepped up their relationship with the United States, as she has mentioned about 5+1. They were also trying to think about creating a unified kind of a, integrated regional security system within the region. Yes, they have been seriously moving on that. They were also looking towards Turkey. They have been also looking towards the south, because entire supply chain after the Ukraine crisis has completely negatively affected the region. No exports could take place to Europe. So they have been looking towards south. Even they have been willing to coexist with Taliban. It's a change in the sense that they are today criticizing Russia, but they're willing to accept Taliban. Now, this change is not a normal change in the mindset. So this ability to coexist, maybe this is the last option, to be happy or to keep the Taliban in a good humor, may serve their more, their national interest. So they lost their hopes on the Russians. All these things have been happening, but because of the new rapprochement between China and Russia, those dreams have been shattered now. Once again, the Russians and the Chinese have come together, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's about Central Asia itself. Chinese and the Russian interest in the region is to keep the Americans out. I don't believe that the Chinese are fundamentally going to change Central Asia. Well, the methodology of doing engagement in Central Asia has changed from a macro to micro level management by the Chinese companies, but essentially is to prevent the American entry into the Eurasian region, primarily because of their own interests. And here I think the Russians and the Chinese have a common interest. I would say marriage of convenience. I won't say long-term strategic, because we have seen the history of Sino-Russian history. They often quarrel, they often have confrontation, they play games. But at the moment, for a midterm, short to midterm, it's a marriage of convenience. They will work together, or sharing of labor. If possibly the Chinese may not so hurriedly enter into security domain, they may still be relying on the Russians. But yes, economically, the Russians have conceded. Many people say, the Russia has become a junior brother of junior, thing of China. I don't think it's a junior senior kind of a thing, but it's, they have a relationship between an aunt and a nephew. Now, how do you explain the relationship between aunt and nephew or niece? That's emotionally something different. It's not brotherly relationship, not sisterly, but it's interesting from a psychological point of view. Today they have come to a situation, but yes, I do agree in the long term. Russia is a great power. They always come back, bounce back, and the Chinese are expanding. Chinese experience of doing business in Central Asia, doing anything in Central Asia is historical. I mean, they refer to Tang Dynasty in the 7th, 8th century. So they were defeated by the Arabs. There will be problems for the Chinese, I won't say, but there are also opportunities for United States. But at the moment, I think things are in flux. Yes, she.
Wonderful, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It was really insightful. You have explained the great power dynamics and enlightened us through your experience. You have touched the critical aspect of the debate of Sinophilia and Sinophobia in the region. Also, you have also touched the aspect of the growing Sino-Russian rapprochement in the region. So again, thank you so much for enlightening us. And without any further delay, I am now coming towards Professor Alexander Cooley, who have a distinguished experience in Central Asian studies. Sir, please, the floor is up to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll build upon those excellent comments, and I'll just I'll start off with talking about the evolution of U.S.-China rivalry. That's one thing that you asked me to comment on, and I want to point out in Central Asia, this is a recent phenomenon. U.S. policy towards the region until really the mid-2010s was framed in terms of two principles. One, strengthening the sovereignty and independence of the Central Asian states, which was also code word for reducing their dependence on Russia. And two, securing access and basing rights to conduct operations in Afghanistan. The US had a facility in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek at the Manas airport, and before that, in Uzbekistan, where it was evicted from Kashi-Kanabad in 2005, but it also had overflight rights and logistical arrangements with all the Central Asian states. So I mention this because there were some fundamental 180-degree changes that occurred at the beginning of the Trump administration. First, the US became increasingly concerned with China's strategic footprint in Central Asia, which included a security facility in Tajikistan, in the walk-on corridor, as well as a security arrangement that allowed for Chinese forces to patrol broad parts of that border with Afghanistan, right? And there was concern about how this would complicate operations in Afghanistan and a possible Afghan withdrawal. Second, US views of Chinese investment also changed completely. Prior to this, Chinese investment in the region, including the new natural gas pipelines or the oil pipelines, was viewed as essentially providing non-Russian connectivity. It was part of this vision that Hillary Clinton announced actually in India of the new Silk Road. And it was viewed as beneficial to these goals. With the Trump administration, the Belt and Road itself became viewed in very different terms, as predatory, as enabling corruption, and also as a vehicle for exerting influence. As countries became more and more indebted, China would request things like political votes, support for various regional initiatives. So it turned on that issue. And then the third issue, Trump administration became very engaged in Uyghur affairs in Xinjiang. It passed the Uyghur Policy Act, which includes all sorts of provisos about reporting, but also supporting exiled Uyghurs in places like Central Asia. And in fact, encouraging the Central Asian governments in their advocacy. The Kazakh government, for instance, for a while, there were a couple of NGOs who were looking at the plight of Kazakh co-ethnics at the detention camps. So I say all this because in his visit to the region, Mike Pompeo adopted this new framing, right? In some ways, beforehand, the US was concerned about Russian influence, and it was concerned about mitigating Islamic radicalism. And now it adopted a kind of anti-China lens. The war has changed this with Russia. I completely agree with the comments that perhaps in the beginning, US and Western officials assumed that the Central Asian states would come to the support of Ukraine, that this kind of decolonize Russia or decenter themselves. But that has not happened. Instead, the opposite has happened. We have seen the re-networking of Central Asia with Russia in all sorts of ways. One, we see the Eurasian Economic Union, Regional Trade Association, being used to circumvent sanctions and to conduct vigorous re-export in the region. And we know this from the differential of increased trade between countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and East Asia and the European Union, and then increased volumes of trade between those Central Asian countries and Russia. And the US has threatened Kazakhstan and some other countries with secondary sanctions, which I think would be a disaster because it would force Kazakhstan and possibly Kyrgyzstan to choose between the US and the Russian markets. And that's not a choice we want them to make. But this shows the urgency to which the region is involved in this economic orientation. And two, on the people level, there were two waves of Russians fleeing Russia in the war. After the first wave, hundreds of thousands of IT workers left the region, and they went to places where that required or that permitted visa-free travel. Armenia, Georgia, but also the Central Asian states. And now we have massive new tech hubs, startups in places like Bishkek, in places like include Astana, and also in Tashkent, right? And so these IT sectors that are being built on Russian IT workers are booming. So that's a second element of this, but it has also created some social tensions. Rents have increased in all these places, these capitals. There is concern about the absorption capacity. Certainly in the smaller countries like Georgia and Armenia, not part of Central Asia, but you've seen these new Russian communities. They're quite visible in these countries. But we also have, as a result of the war, the greatest Russian labor shortage since the early 1990s. So what does this mean? This means Central Asian migrant workers, which constitute a huge proportion of GDP, these remittances that are sent, especially in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. We've seen the data on Central Asian migration to Russia explode in 2023. And so we're seeing more person-to-person connectivity within Russia and Russians in Central Asia, and the reorientation of trade. What does this mean in terms of Russian and Chinese sort of relations over Central Asia? I completely agree with the ambassador. I don't think the junior partner is necessarily the right way to think about this. I think Central Asia is not a source of overt competition because the projects of Moscow and Beijing differ, and they overlap and they can coexist. Yeah. And so what we've seen in Central Asia is actually the blueprint for how Russia and China accommodate themselves in a particular region to then exclude and increasingly push back Western influence, the Western security imprint, Western norms, and so forth. So I actually think Central Asia is instructive, not as the source of Russia-Chinese competition, but as an example of how they can work things out, formally and informally. And I would argue you've seen this since the US withdrawal in Afghanistan, where you're seeing both Chinese and Russian-led security initiatives and regional connectivity initiatives sort of coexisting. So I've used a lot of my time, but I'll just say it's a dynamic region and it's certainly changing. But in terms of US interest in the region at the moment, it's all eyes on Ukraine, and that is now determining, I think, US interactions with the Central Asian states.
Thank you so much, sir, for an insightful commentary on Central Asia. Your immense experience you have highlighted and touched a lot of insightful areas, which included the evolution of US-China rivalry in the Central Asian republics, the nature of Chinese investment, the aggressive coronavirus diplomacy. You have also mentioned that Russia has historically considered the area as its strategic backyard. So therefore, American posture towards the region was to counter the Russian influence. Then the securitization of the region was considered by considering the Islamic radicalism as a referent object and now impeding Chinese rise. So you have covered very crucial aspects of the Sino-Russian cooperation. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your insightful commentary. So without any further delay, I am passing the torch to Dr. Preeti Das. Doctor, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Shahid. In fact, I must acknowledge here, first of all, that In JNU, I have learned a lot from Stobdan, who had participated in various conferences, and we have learned from him a lot. And I have been reading his material, writings, books, articles, everything. So one more thing I wanted to emphasize is my background is not political science background; it is the cultural background. So therefore, I'm looking at the region from the cultural perspective also, to an extent, not completely from the political science perspective. The second thing is that a lot has already been said, but then something I might repeat of the from the previous presentations, but that would be in order to reiterate the arguments that I'm raising in my presentation. So once again, good evening, everyone. First of all, let me thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on such a relevant topic. So the changes that we have been talking about in the world that are occurring, that have occurred in the last few decades, are not going to end here, and they are changing dramatically even in the future, and are going to have a global impact. So it was talking about, like, from the beginning, it was not easy for the Central Asian states also to become an independent player, to determine their own path of development, free choice of economic policies and development, establishment of its own economic diplomatic ties with the strategic partners. So the initial priority that has already been sounded here is that to reduce the Russian presence from the region. But while doing so, while developing their own independent partnership with the rest of the world, they did not get much support in the beginning of the period from the US, from the Europe, or from, for that matter, even India. They did not get much. So the only support that came to them was from the Chinese side also, that too economically. So it was during this difficult period that the Central Asian countries first realized that what a profitable and at the same time dangerous geopolitical space they are in. So the shift of the Central Asian from the periphery to the geostrategic region, where the interest of the major powers are increasingly intersecting, the Russia, China, and the America. Now, the point is that it is no more triangular, the Russia, China, and the US. Now it is the US versus China, more US versus China and Russia. In fact, in the immediately post September 11 issue, where the Walls had mentioned in the year 2002 that United States had pushed Russia and China closer together. So it is, and further now the Russia-Ukraine war, which the partnership that has actually pushed them much closer than possibly the ever before. Now the point is the Russia-China partnership remains limited and will continue to do so. But they did have several similar issues on certain several strategic issues, like voicing against the US hegemony in NATO's disbandment rather than expansion, or criticized NATO's bombing campaign in Serbia, or US withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and so on. But they have also been, there are incidents that they have been supporting each other. For instance, in the Chechen issue, the China and the Taiwan issue, the Russia supported. Now, in short, what I'm trying to say is that the China has the geopolitical, political, economic, and cultural leverages in Central Asian region, whereas the US idea of promoting democracy did not completely suit the political elites of the Central Asian society. But the China and the kind of investment that China that are coming from Chinese region are also, they are using a kind of that is the predatory manner that the repayment or payment back of these loans is using, where China is being is forced to grant China control of some of the Central Asian resources or the territory. So giving the control of these things to the Chinese region. So the famous example that one can cite beginning from the 2011, where the Tajikistan ceded territory of size bigger than the Singapore to the China in return of unspecified amount of the debt. So here we are talking about the presence, when we are talking about the US presence in that. So there are still immense opportunity. Why? Because here one point is that I would like to mention is, we in Asia, that is inclusive of Central Asian region, we look at the Europe as superior to us in every sense. That is in sense of the lifestyle, in sense of the employment, in every sense we look at the Europe, and we do consider Europe as a superior to the Asian part, and strive towards moving towards that region. But the point is, this does not suit to the political elite of the Central Asian region. So therefore, I believe there is an immense possibility of for using this opportunity, rather than making that presence where the competition we are talking about, that it does not really require to have a kind of pushing things at any platform. It can be done in a very subtle way, like what Professor Stobdan has already mentioned. So the importance is, because in terms of military, the US has troops have been the removal of the US forces from the Central Asian region, or the withdrawal of Afghanistan forces. So that is where the presence has already ruled. But then even in the economic and the political terms, the economic presence of China is much higher in the region, which is growing, in fact, 40%. And if you recall that the last 3 decades, so it has grown 100% and so on. Whereas counting on to the American presence in terms of economy, it is only with the Kazakhstan, and then next to the Uzbekistan region only, and after that only the 3 countries fall. So the point is here that the concern that is made is the threat that is coming from China is not only economic and the political, and what has already been mentioned is that China is trying to spread in the other region also, and trying to get involved in the other region where the educational institutions are concerned, where the other political, cultural institutions are acquiring. So this is basically, this competition is acquiring a kind of a regional dimension, where both the countries are trying to attract the region towards its own thing. Now, point is, when talking about the policies, one power is trying to is coming up with the other policy which is just opposite to the other. So like for instance, the C5+1, we talked about the American thing, and then immediately the China comes up with the C+C5 countries format that is coming up. So this is not exactly oversighting the thing, the American presence there, but then it is trying to balance it. Then similarly, we talk about if we take the Quad nations. So again, then there is like when India criticizes or the US policies are implemented, then the Russia alleges that it is being the unilateralist, that US is adopting a unilateralist approach. And this statement had actually come immediately after the Jaishankar's Prasad's presentation in the event in Bangkok, where he had mentioned about that the entire Indo-Pacific region could be benefited from the delivery of public goods by the 4 nations. And this was not appreciated by Moscow. And they said that this the Quad, they called it that it is a divisive and exclusivist tool, which is being adopted by the United States. And whereas they are forgetting that Russia do share privileged relationship. Forget about the China-India relationship, but then they do share. So their attempt to come up with this, joint trilateral, the cooperation from the Russian perspective has been there earlier also, which has not been so successful. where the Russian Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov had come up with the proposal of making a strategic triangle where Russia, India, and China to act as a stabilizing force, stabilizing force in the multipolar world order to pave the way. But that proved to be impractical. However, Russia and China had gone ahead with the Sino-Russian Treaty of Good Neighborly Friendship and Cooperation. So similar, and then another point is that similar to NATO, what about the argument that has already been about the NATO thing. So that is the encircling Russia. The similar groups have had recently the group had the meeting where Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Russia recently had the meeting and all. So here the point is that what are the potential that the US one can look for in the region. So there we are. I refer back to Jammu Kashli, who had actually criticized Tajikistan for using its sovereignty to for the repayment of the loan. And this is where I would want to reiterate the same thing, that the people in Central Asia, what Professor Stobdan has also mentioned, that the people in Russia, in Central Asia region, do not have favorable perception about the Chinese thing. They are still more inclined to, however, I would not say that they are completely inclined towards the Europe or the West all, but then yes, they are definitely getting fascinated by the, or attracting, which is not actually getting support from the authoritarian regime of the region. So following the US does have an opportunity, and the main threat that is coming not from the Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative, it is also coming from the maritime economic issues, where the United States does have its bases, but then it has the China has better access to these bases. So the point is, when what type of policies in a broad given this circumstances could be used. Here US can utilize or can be open to be inclusive or can invite India in its Central Asian vision, because India is lagging behind in properly utilizing its cultural ties, which China is successfully doing, utilizing its ancient cultural ties to spreading across the other sphere rather than sticking to only the political or the economic issues. So here, United States can actually involve India in its own vision and come up with the however recently the Indian government's policies, that neighborhood policies, are working towards restoration of ancient cultural ties and working on the Indian presence on there, because otherwise if we see that the region is being it's politically, if we see, it is getting complicated, and I as a belonging to a different field, how do I look at it? I do not see that other than cultural or the policy like a peaceful rise of China. So something similar like peaceful of rise of China in the last decades had emerged. Something of that sort should be, which actually in a very subtle way tries to attract the people and tries to kind of monitor the situation. So this is where I see the policies should be more towards the understanding. Because one thing that I wanted to say is the last thing that I want to say is, but generally when the perception of the Europe thing has been that we have the mission of civilizing the other, it should be that not the Europe is working for the Asian countries, it is working with the Asian countries. So rather than projecting the democratic ideas or human rights and the values which is coming from the West, but it should be calculated the regional aspects of it and promote only. So the US policy should not actually try to get deeper into the socio-cultural realities of the local people. So that is where I see the efforts could be made in terms of kind of balancing the Russia, China, and because US presence is very important for Indian security and safety also. So that is what all I had to say. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Preeti, for your insightful commentary. You have explained with much detail the geopolitical chessboard, Sino-US rivalry, their policies and postures in the region. Indeed, I believe that you have given an alternative perspective when you mentioned that there is no more a triangular competition. Instead, it is now being more of like US versus China. So I think it was a very good pathway set by you: US retrenchment, growing Chinese foray and ingress in Central Asia through its massive investment. You have also mentioned the platform of C5+1. Thank you so much. That was really a great insight. We were expecting to have our final panelist, Dr. Ali Beg, but I think due to the last minute emergency and due to the political instability and turmoil in Pakistan, I think he wasn't able to join. So praying and hoping for the things to get better. So thank you all of the panelists for doing an excellent job in delivering the scholarly remarks on such broad topic ranging from political, economic, bureaucratic, and military dimensions. So now we are moving on for the final phase where we'll be open for Q&A sessions. We have a few in the chat box and few have been posed to us by several researchers. So I am starting with the first question. The first question has been asked by Rahul Gupta to specifically from Professor Cooley. He stated that you believe that China and Russia have more reason to cooperate in Central Asia than to compete, given their common interest in opposing or restricting the Western influence. Do you still believe that this is going to hold even in the longer term, and that Russia might not feel threatened by rising Chinese profile in the region? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think exactly it's put its finger on the Russian dilemma here in terms of timeline. I will say this: I think you've seen a kind of a period of the two sides feeling each other out, and about 10 years ago, I think Russian analysts and commentators would talk about some of the red lines they had with China, right? So for instance, they would talk about the Eurasian Economic Union, how that could be made to work with China's sort of economic ambitions and plans for the region. Or they would talk about the fact that they would be very skeptical and wary of a Chinese formal security presence. But these things have happened. And the reaction from Russia has been absolutely muted, right? And so I think they've gone away from red lines, right? And instead are in this kind of formal mutual accommodation mode. I do want to point out that China has made concessions too, right? It's not all one way. So if you look in the latest communique between Xi and Putin, Xi recognizes the role of the CSTO and the role that it plays in bringing security and stability to the region. And you have seen also, I would say, China take a more quiet approach to the region over the last year, certainly post-COVID. It shut down its borders because of coronavirus restrictions and so forth. So we've seen a kind of a, yes, it's on Chinese terms, but China has made some concessions to Russia in symbolic terms. Now, I think over the long term, if this geopolitical situation changes, then certainly I think people in Moscow will wake up in the post-Putin era and might say, oh my gosh, what have we done? Right? Sort of allowing, not just in Central Asia, but Chinese penetration of areas economically in to the east of the country as well. So at the moment, though, the overwhelming, I would say almost obsession of Russia on the foreign policy front is to bring down and act as revisionists to the US-led world order. That's what they frame the Ukraine war as an example of. And so China is absolutely okay with this, right? Because it means that essentially they can continue to do what they do mostly under the radar. And as long as they give Russia public deference, right, for being a region's privileged power, a region's security guarantor, as long as they talk about, opposing US unilateralism in the world order, Russia feels that it's worth it, right, to have this sort of Central Asian cooperation. But you're absolutely right. Over the longer term, when there isn't this obsession with the West, it seems reasonable, I think, that the relationship has the potential to change, but we're a long way from that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for a brief and detailed answer for the question. So moving towards the next question, I am unable to pronounce the name, sorry for the inconvenience. The question is posed towards Ambassador Punchak Stobdan. The questionnaire is basically stating that as Russia is still one of the most spoken languages in Central Asia, how do the Central Asian states balance between Russian and the Mandarin? As Ambassador have mentioned that Mandarin has been increasingly taught in the Central Asian educational institutions. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, I mentioned only in terms of language, but I didn't say in terms of reorienting the educational system. I believe that science, mathematics, and all other subjects are still taught in Russian or in English. Mandarin is still not been introduced. There are resistance, but resistance is not because of Russia. Resistance is mainly because of their own ethnic factors, the social factors, many other factors. But I'm afraid the job employment which the Chinese would offer, if you are a Mandarin speaker, you could easily do export and import in Xinjiang. You go to Urumqi and get your consignment booked, and then bring back to Central Asia and do trading with Europe. Now, this is a transit kind of a situation where Mandarin is going to be very useful for traders, for businessmen, for young people. So I said in that context, I didn't say at the moment, but I think at the same time, every big nations have their own universities now. There's a Turkish university everywhere. There's American university. There's a British one. We tried to set up in Tashkent, but so far this has not materialized as yet. The Chinese have universities, schools, primary schools. Even 8 years old children are taught Chinese language. So there is no competition as such, but it's an assortment of, at times I think that there's so many external influences, so many external support and effort that the Central Asian might lose their own orientation. It's a sponsored kind of a education system. I don't know. Sometimes I've seen in the case of Nepal, there are thousands and thousands of NGOs have operated in Nepal. This has led to insurgency. The state doesn't have too much control about what's happening. This happened to many smaller countries, and I do feel Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan might have problem in the long run because of these language issues, because of other issues. But I don't think the last chapter of the geopolitical game in Central Asia is written as yet. It's yet to be written. And to me, I think it will depend on the final outcome of the Ukraine war. If the Ukrainians win the war, things would certainly change in a fundamental way. If Russia manages this issue with Ukraine, then the Russians might rebound because the ground is already there, the Russian military bases are there, Russian economy is working, people are speaking Russian. So there is a vertical structure that from the top to bottom, the political leadership, intelligentsia, teachers, everybody speaks Russian, and the media is controlled by Russia. So Russia is the source of modernity, a window to Europe or West. It will continue, but Chinese have their own advantages, economic and other things, which is also essential. So I won't say too much competition here, but I think they know how to balance. They have played this game again and again and again in the past from the history. So the Russians and the Chinese would know how to play game in the Eurasian. It's a Silk Route. In fact, the Belt and Road is also along those games of Silk Route, where the spying was a in thing. There were markets, there were prostitutions, there were gambling, there were all kind of things were happening on the Silk Route. And from my point of view, Chinese are very, very cleverly trying to expand their area of influence. Um, what is Belt and Road? Belt and Road is the old map of Buddhism. The Buddhist spread all over Asia through the certain routes. No warrior went to Asia to spread Buddhism. Buddhism spread on the trade. So what the Chinese are doing is to replicate the old Indian way of spreading, influences through modern way, new means. So if the Ukrainian war is a decisive thing, I would say that is really up to the on the Russian front. But the Chinese obviously trying to integrate the region economically, and to a certain extent, the way that CKU railway was finalized last year in Tashkent, Chinese are there in Fergana Valley now through railway. That changes once they're in Fergana Valley, they're in Afghanistan, they're in Pakistan, they're in India, or wherever they want to go. That's a critical, and the Russians' ability to resist that, especially to change the railway gauge. I think it's not working. To prevent the railway gauge to be changed is simply not working. And I find that it's extremely a thing. But as far as we are concerned, we don't look at SCO and other things as a important institution. I mean, this is how I look at it. SCO is not an institution, it's an instrument. It's simply an instrument. If you look at carefully, what does SCO do for us? SCO provides us a platform to sort out small things or big things on the sidelines, which is important. This year is the Bilawal Bhutto was here. So it's about India Park, whatever those things are there, good or bad, doesn't matter. But SCO makes that thing happen. Last year, it was Prime Minister Modi who said to President Putin that this is not the era of war. So that captured the imagination of the world, that India is asserting against Russia on the Ukrainian issue. Year before that, we had a conflict with China at the line of actual control in the Himalayas. It was SCO which allowed us to go for disengagement between the Chinese and so the SCO per se is not important. What you achieve through the SCO, that's the real. But obviously, at the working level, it's a process. SCO is a process. There are many templates on which we are working. India is working, and many others are working together. And bilateral issues are avoided. So there is a sense of cooperation, but there's a long-term, goal to achieve certain thing at the institutional level. Well, it's a sort of playing another kind of a game through multilateral means, and Asians are well known for that. Russians, Chinese, Indians, Persian, Pakistanis, whoever, they were good masters in this game. They know how to play. There are nuances. Now, what we could do, suggest President Biden, the post-Afghanistan withdrawal, we must remember that Central Asia-China relation is built on the Chinese, on the Central Asian compromising on their land in favor of China by their previous leaders, their present leaders, or the autocrats, or whatever they are. They have been compromising on sovereignty issues, on the territorial issues, on the issues of agriculture issues, or culture, on many other issues. And because of some reasons, the Central Asians have been trying to put all these issues under the wrap. Now, the opportunity for the American is to prop up land nationalism, democracy. Today, they don't have much voice. to express in the current context. If the Americans are trying to, encourage the Central Asians to think about their land, in a way, it's a kind of a nationalism to be grown, then I think China is in trouble. I mentioned this to a Chinese diplomat once. He said, this is the biggest useful assessment I've ever got, and I'm going to pass it on to the Chinese authorities, that in future you're going to have problems. Whether, there have been revolutions in China on the issue of land, whether in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, the Aksu incident, the Kyrgyz have given a lot of land to the Chinese. Tajiks have given a lot of land to the Chinese. Even today in Almaty, you have frequent demonstrations against the Chinese on the agriculture, labor. The Chinese have to bring their own private security to this region. There are a lot of things. And on top of that, there is something called resource nationalism. The Chinese are not trying to make money through products in the region, through selling small shirts on t-shirt, that which they have done in the 90s. Today, the Chinese are into extraction of minerals. And there is a typical psychology in Central Asia. The moment you dig earth and try to extract something, it hits them. They think their gold has been taken away, their treasures have been taken away by the Chinese. Whole things have been stolen away. Maybe it's only silver, but they think it's a diamond is gone. So it brings a lot of pressure, and people rise up, anti-China feeling, these things can grow. This is number one. And number two, if United States is smart, I would not suggest, honestly, that United States could look for an option to engage with various Islamic societies as the last option. I won't say, encouraging fundamentalism or terrorism or things like that, but Islam is an important issue in Central Asia, and so far, just to keep the present dispensation very happy and to manage the situation because of the Russia and China factor, they have been avoiding that. But ultimately, the United States will do what they have done in Middle East, in Central Asia as well. And that is the only last hope for United States to create, I won't say trouble, but to steer the problem in Central Asia with an eye on China or Russia. Otherwise, it doesn't have a border, it doesn't have economy, it doesn't have transportation. What do you do? So obviously, George Soros is very unpopular there at the moment. There are many others who do have such things, and Turkey is another one which has the potential to create, local nationalism vis-a-vis China. And these are very emotive issues, and these are not easy to be kept under wrap for a very long time. But these are the only possible ways President Biden or anybody in the United States could think politically. I won't support that, because any source of religious kind of a nationalism would bounce back. I don't think even Pakistan would support that idea. They want an ideal situation at the moment. Taliban has not really played that card at the moment in Central Asia. I was in Termiz very recently, and I was there for almost 6 hours on the Uzbek side of the border. Absolutely, there's no problem between the Central Asians and the Taliban. The trucks would move across the border. They do a lot of business, and they don't seem to be having any apprehension. Well, Termiz is a very modern city, but just across Mazar-e-Sharif is still very poor. But I don't see any sense of confrontation there. Hopefully, it works that way. We really don't know. Nobody knows the future, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for such a detailed description. So now we are having some few questions from Dr. Aminul Karim. First question is that how do you think the India's neighborhood first policy is effective? This question is from Dr. Preeti Das. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you for the question. Neighborhood policy has actually been positively, because this policy has started and expanded, which is covering all aspects of the cultural relationship that the India and Central Asian countries had. It is touching upon the trade issues, it is touching upon the political issues, it is touching upon the economic issues. And the point is that it is not at the superficial level, it is actually percolating down, where the what Stobdan sir has mentioned, that university has not yet opened, but then there are number of schools which are actually working in. So number of the efforts are being made at the various level, and various institutions are involved in promoting. So I definitely see that the neighborhood policy is going to yield positive this thing outcome. One, because the Central Asian people are also closely attached culturally. And second, that when we talk about that, the India and Central Asia ties were actually disrupted under the Soviet period, when they did not have the direct this thing. Even then, the cultural similarities were prevailing there. So the neighborhood policy is going to be very, very effective in the region, and it has already at various platforms yielded the result. One more thing which I wanted to say is what when we are talking about the restoration or continuation of any religion and all, one must remember that anything from the past, the historical thing, cannot be deleted. So that even the Russian presence that the Central Asian people are trying to, reduce or minimize, or they do not have very positive approach towards the Chinese aggression that the region has. This is something that cannot be completely eradicated. One must learn that one has to move ahead with the fact that these factors are going to remain throughout. They were there in the past, they will be remaining there in the future also. So somewhere the approach which should be like the Chinese policy, which is actually in a very subtle way comparing. I would also like to quote here what Dostoevsky had once said. This was with regard to Russo-Turkic War long time back in 1844. So this is somewhere he had mentioned that, yes, I mean, if Russia wants to dominate, it has to dominate in the sense it has to win the thought of the people. So somewhere in that, this aspect is missing, which I feel is there. So the neighborhood policy is taking into account all these factors that are actually going to play a key role. So that is what, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Preeti, for such an insightful comment. So we are having some few questions prepared by some researchers. Perhaps Dr. Alexander Cooley, you would like to answer that. The question is that following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the security vacuum that has been created is now being filled by growing Sino-Russian bromance. So in your opinion, is it a marriage of convenience or a long-term strategic partnership?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this gets back to my answer to the previous question. I think the current moment and the short term is the strategy, right? So whether it's convenient or not, I would say it's actually real and it's engaged, and you've seen mutual accommodations. And I just want everyone to just consider the differences over 20 years in terms of the US strategic presence and how everyone reacted. So when the US set up in 2001 after 9/11, and it concluded these basing agreements and these logistics agreements, both China and Russia, for different reasons, supported these arrangements. Russia, because Vladimir Putin was the first world leader to call George W. Bush and offer the space, some would say against the advice of his own general staff. Russian perceptions of the US presence turned after 18 months, right? After major combat operations were concluded in Afghanistan, and Russia began to perceive that the US military was in the region to project geopolitical influence, right? In concert with non-state actors and the color revolutions, and infringe upon its area of influence. But China also supported this. And the main quid pro quo China got was designating the groups in Xinjiang as part of this global war on terror, right? And having the US State Department put them on the list and sort of make public comments that they were Al-Qaeda affiliated and so forth, right? If you fast forward 20 years, the main concern of China and Russia is to prevent a US presence even beyond the right? And so you saw intensive negotiations between the US and the Central Asian states to gain some access rights to fly some drones to be able to survey and monitor the withdrawal. And Moscow put pressure on all of the Central Asian states to deny this request. And interestingly enough, Putin made it a point saying China was also opposed to this, right? So you've seen this denial of space. So the primary concern is no longer the Taliban in the region. It's the US leaving the region. And so what you've seen, both Chinese and Russia pursuing individual regional initiatives to address Afghanistan. And they're on parallel tracks. They say that they coordinate in Iraq, but it's not substantive. But you see Russia using the CSTO to hold exercises and border exercise cooperation, especially in Tajikistan. Also some in Kyrgyzstan. It's been having CSTO issues, but with Armenia rather than with the Central Asian states. And of course, the Central Asian states themselves, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan fought a border conflict that was significant. Over 100,000 people were dislocated as a result of this, and the populations on that border unmixed, so to speak. And China itself is trying to lead a regional response to the region. So I think just because we don't have formal recognitions of the Taliban doesn't mean that Russia and China aren't proceeding strategically as if they assume the Taliban is going to be there with some permanency. And in fact, they are trying to garner support with some success. So saying, look how the US continues to freeze your assets and is an unhelpful actor in terms of promoting regional connectivity. So the world is very different 20 years on, and I think the marginalization of the US and the ability of the Central Asian states to deny what the US was asking for, I think is indicative of those changes.
Sir, thank you so much for an insightful commentary on the question. I am again returning towards Dr. Preeti, and the question is specifically to her, that what are the India's expectations for its role in Central Asia as the current chair of the SCO? Over to you, Doctor.
Sorry, I missed it. What are the?
The question is that what are the expectations of India in Central Asia as the current chair of the SCO?
I think I'm sorry that I won't be able to answer this question because I am not from the political science background, so I won't be able to answer this question. Sorry.
Okay, ma'am, no problem. So over to the panelists.
Ambassador Stobdan, would you like to comment here? Would you like to comment on the question?
We would love to
Well,
listen from Ambassador Stobdan.
Pardon?
We would love to listen from Ambassador Stobdan.
Shahid,
okay.
pause it. Give the question to Stobdan, Ambassador.
Yeah, many curious.
Thank you, sir, but I won't be able to. Thank you for taking the question. Yeah, on my yeah.
A lot of questions have been raised. Why the Indians are so active in the SCO, whereas it is supposed to be a partner of United States, and SCO is against the United States. So this question has been raised again and again. But this is the misunderstanding people do have about Indian foreign policy. India is not aligned to anyone, neither to Russia nor to United States. India is a power in itself, so I don't think India has to align with anybody. So it takes its decision in its own terms. But more importantly, India has adopted certain approaches to push multilateralism. So SCO is seen in the context of pushing up the multilateral diplomacy, engagement, especially in the post-COVID era, where the cooperation, regional cooperation is required. And without the help of every country in the neighborhood or extended neighborhood, this is not possible. Now, with regards to Central Asia, we really don't have a particular means or particular way to engage with this region. There has been some historical legacy about India and Central Asia. She just Preeti mentioned about the culture, history, and all that. But more importantly, Central Asia is a product of Indo-Soviet friendship. All this nostalgia still continues. If you go to rural areas in Central Asia, southern Central Asia, I'm not saying Astana or Palvador or Kustanai and all these areas are more Russia-oriented, but the real Central Asia, the heart of Central Asia, southern Central Asia, is more Hindustan-oriented. They call us Hindustan, so which includes, the history of many, many years. So they look at India through their own emotional, psychological, cultural eyes, and they relate to us. That has been an advantage, but obviously this will not continue for a very long time. Today, even the Central Asian watch South Korean movies rather than Indian movies. So that's a reality. This will change, obviously. Changes will always happen. But SEO was adopted consciously to engage with the region. By not being there, you don't know what's happening. It's better to engage. So the SEO membership was taken up very seriously by India since 2005. And through SEO, as I told you, we look at SEO as an instrument, as a means rather than an end. And we really don't know what we want to achieve in Central Asia. Perhaps we have a benign presence. And benign presence is very good vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia. End of the day, Russia still controls large resources, even beyond Central Asia into Central Siberia, Eastern Siberia, into Far East. And Indians have a dream to be present in the Siberian world. That's the extension of Indic world. If you go to even southern Siberia, you dig a little bit, you find Indian civilization. That cannot be washed away. So India has an ambition to be culturally, at least whatever. And secondly, I don't think this region, the whole of this region, look at India in a very negative way. India is seen as a very friendly, non-aggressive, non-expansionist power. So that's there. And I've been there for 30 years in that area, interacted with every section of the society. They do carry some soft corner for India. Economic capabilities have a problem in terms of transportation, connectivity issues. We're trying to resolve all these issues, but it's not easy. That's part of the larger game. Connectivity is the part of the larger game in Eurasia. So, well, the Chinese are doing very well, but somewhere I think the Indian dreams and the Chinese dreams would meet somewhere. I do hope that. But at the moment, these are not possible. There is some kind of a zero-sum game which continues. But SEO, yes, it has pushed a lot of things from the Indian interest in the region in the last couple of years. Presidentship has been a big boost for multilateralism, and hoping that the coming summit in the month of in September or June, I don't remember now. I think in June, will boost India's image. I mean, every country conducts summit level meetings, but India, we do have the opportunity now to host both G20 and the SCO. It pushes a lot of things on diplomacy, on infrastructure. I mean, the G20 was celebrated, organized all over the country, which puts India on a different level. So there are tangible and non-tangible benefits for us. There is no other way that we could engage with the Central Asians. But let me tell you that Central Asians have started looking towards South Asia, or specifically India, more sharply now than before. South Asia was seen as a very dark cloud, which they don't know. They're all Moscow, Ankara, or maybe Beijing. But today, we've seen a lot of Central Asians coming to India for various purposes, for medical tourism. Every day we have a couple of flights from every capital. They're full of traders and especially medical people with having medical problems. They come for surgery. It's a cheap option for them. Either they go to Moscow or Turkey, which is 3 or 4 times more expensive than coming to Delhi. So that attracts a lot of things. And well, I think it's more of a nostalgic issue between India and Central Asia. We were interrupted for a very long time. SCO is useful, but we have other mechanism like Russia, India, China, RIC, which is at the political level, at the diplomatic level. This is a spread out now into military affair, into art, culture, sports, to everything covers up. So I think it's a institutional process through which this regional integration has been emphasized on, how to create, but then again, political issues come up on the front and they tend to disrupt the process. India, Pakistan is a contradiction in SCO, but the whole intention is to bring these two countries together is also the motivation of most of the Central Asian countries. I talked to a lot of Kazakhs and Uzbeks. He says, look, SCO's ultimate aim is to bring India and Pakistan together. That can be one aspect. But it's an opportunity for everyone to engage with each other. And this is how we look at SCO. But I've seen that it is the bilateral which is more important than the regional grouping.
Sir, thank you so much for your detailed and insightful commentary on the question. I think we should proceed to our last question, which is open to all the panelists. So anyone of you want to answer that? The question is that, how will the geopolitical chessboard of the Central Asia will look like in the future? It is open to all of the panelists which would like to answer that.
Professor Cooley, would like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, well, we'll have to wait and see. I'll say something about what Central Asian states aspire to, right? One concept that has been frequently cited with regards to Central Asian diplomacy is this idea of multi-vector foreign policy, right? This idea that you want to pursue productive relations with all major and emerging powers. And in some ways, the 2000s were the kind of major era of multi-vectorism, where the Central Asian states had security cooperation with the US, they had political cooperation with Russia, and they started also the migration ties. And this is when China became, I wouldn't say a public goods, a club goods provider in the region. Its investment really took off in the 2000s, right? Let's not forget, in the year 2000, China was only doing $1 billion worth of trade a year with Central Asia, right? By the end of the decade, this had escalated to 50. However, the problem that the Central Asian states face is that both Moscow and Beijing are engaging with the region with a greater intensity and with more well-defined instruments. And many of these forms of engagement are designed to pressure the Central Asian states and also to exclude others from being in the region, right? So now we see actual Belt and Road mechanism. We actually see, I think the private security presence that was mentioned by the ambassador in the region is also huge, because it sets up different types of understandings of what is political risk, what is insecurity, as well as actual sort of operations. And you see Russian intensification with the region, right? So yes, all of the countries aspire to multi-vectorism, but what's the other vector? What's the alternative to Russia and China? It's no longer the US because it's not engaged in the region as it was before. China is certainly one of those partnerships. Korea is certainly one of those partnerships. Japan, Turkey, the Gulf states. But you need to have a lot of engagement to reach a critical mass that you can actually call it multi-vectorism. And I think this is the dilemma that geography challenges Central Asian states, is how to create room for maneuver, right? To be able to in turn leverage relations with Beijing and leverage relations with Moscow, because increasingly these two powers are so important in the region. So I think the strategy going forward is to try and join as many kinds of regional initiatives, connectivity initiatives as possible, and make that third pillar. Once we assumed in the West it would be a Western-oriented pillar, that's not at all clear now, but to at least give some options beyond Moscow and Beijing.
Thank you, Dr. Cooley, for such an insightful commentary and comment, and all the panelists here. Indeed, there are many questions and a lot to do on the Central Asian scholarships. However, I am now moving towards Dr. Indu for the concluding remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shahir. I would like to thank you to the speakers, Ambassador Stobdan, Professor Cooley, Dr. Preeti. Thank you so much for the insightful comment, and that's indeed it's an informative session looking at the questions in the chat and the engagement of the participants. We will post this video at our website and on social media, and we will share with the experts very soon. Next, please stay tuned with our next events, and definitely we are going to do a book talk of Dr. Aminul Karim, written by the Dr. Aminul Karim. It's the topic is the geopolitics, the Bay of Bengal geopolitics and Quad. So, and to support us to spread the word of the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, thank you all again. Have a great time.